Are we good online? Okay, you can go ahead and start the video then.
Now, after Jesus had been teaching all day on the Sea of Galilee, he instructed his disciples to get into a boat with him and travel to the other side. Now, as we've learned, observant Jews stuck pretty closely to the northwestern region of the Sea of Galilee. The other side represented everything that was impure, decadent, and sinful. Certainly not Jewish. Now, the Greeks and then the Romans built up 10 cities called the Decapolis to the south and to the east side of the Sea of Galilee. These cities were exemplars to Hellenistic culture and power. There were temples to worship idols, bathhouses, stadiums, theaters. These were all unclean places to go. Certainly they were all bad to any practicing Jew.
Now remember earlier when Jesus sent his disciples out, he instructed them not to go to the Gentiles, but to the Jews. And also remember that Jews saw non-Jews as ancillary to God's overall plan. So Jesus was making a pretty surprising statement to his disciples here. The kingdom of God would now be shared with the Gentiles who lived on the other side.
While on their way, the Gospels record that a sudden storm kicked up and the disciples were very scared. They probably also thought that the storm was confirmation that they should not be going to the other side. Now, it's not uncommon here in the late fall and winter for storms to form very quickly and unexpectedly from the higher elevations on the eastern side of the lake. Within minutes, the Sea of Galilee can produce waves up to 6 feet tall, which can easily overwhelm a first-century Galilean fishing boat. A trip to the other side soon became a teachable moment for Jesus, who, by the way, was feeling pretty relaxed, given the circumstances.
Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Mark 4:38 through 41.
Okay, well, for those of you who asked about the videos from the last couple weeks, Jeremy figured out that one of the videos we showed a couple weeks ago, I guess, got flagged for copyright stuff on YouTube. But thanks to Jer, he cut that out and got that upload. If you're in there and watching any of these on YouTube and we're talking about a video we just watched and you didn't hear it or see it, that's probably why. So just keep that in mind if you're watching them later. But getting our this is week 4. We're starting. The bulk of tonight will be on chapter 10, and then, like I said, next week we should. I'm hoping to get through the chapter 15. We already did some of the main stories from like chapters 13 and 14. We talked about Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath. So after chapter 10 tonight, which will be kind of make up the bulk of our time, we'll hit a few stories and see how Luke uses them in those chapters. And then we'll start next week, our final night together, with the parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, or sometimes called the prodigal son. And we'll look at a few other parables that are unique to Luke, like one super confusing one, the parable of the shrewd manager, some other known ones like the parable of the persistent widow, and then we'll talk about the Jesus finally making it to Jerusalem along his journey in the Gospel of Luke, makes it to Jerusalem, and then the crucifixion, death, and resurrection and appearances after. We'll close out our time together. Just as a reminder, some of our themes we've been seeing over and over again in Luke, and we'll certainly see tonight. Luke's focus on the poor, the lowly, the marginalized, the outcast. His unique focus on stories of women, often pairing them with stories of men, sometimes immediately back to back and others not always back to back. And then where we're going to get to tonight, right before chapter 10, the turning point of Luke's entire gospel of this movement towards Jerusalem. We already saw that a little bit at the beginning of Luke's gospel when there's the journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem for the birth of Jesus, and then when Satan takes him to the top of the temple in Jerusalem after the temptation in the wilderness, how Luke put that last to show that constant movement towards Jerusalem. And we're going to see tonight that Jesus is setting his face towards Jerusalem for this kind of what's often called the travel narrative, the journey narrative in the Gospel of Luke. And then, of course, Luke's focus on discipleship and what that means, and certainly what it means for the Gentiles to be included in the plan of God. We see that in Luke's Gospel through Jesus, and then in his sequel, the book of Acts, through the life of the church. So we saw this map last week, but so just as a reminder of where we are here in our story of that, right in the middle there, that blue is the town of Nazareth. And there's that Nazareth Ridge that if you stand in Nazareth, you can look out over the Jezreel Valley and see all these other places that are highlighted here with colored circles of major events from Israelite history, major events from what we would call the Old Testament. And for 30 years, Jesus is growing up in Nazareth. He can look out over the Nazareth Ridge and see Mount Carmel there in the red circle where Elijah fought the prophets of Baal. To look out over towards the green circle where Gideon led the people to the spring. Look out over at that pink circle where Jezebel, had murdered Naboth for his vineyard, and then herself was hung from the walls and devoured by dogs. Up there in Mount Tabor is where Deborah led the Israelites into battle. Not far from there is where King Saul and his sons were hung from the walls after being killed. And of course, our story where we saw last week and where we start tonight, just as a way to tie it together for Luke, in that orange circle, that little town of Nain, where Jesus goes and raises the only son of a widow there. Remember, having an only son having a husband who's already died and having your only other male relative, your only son, die, would have left her destitute, dependent on the charity of anybody else in the village. But Jesus raises her and gives her back, it says, gives him back to her. And we talked about how there was those parallels. It just, with both the prophet Elijah and the prophet Elisha, they both raised a boy from the dead. And it says, gave them back to their mother. And it also tells us that the instance with Elisha happened just a stone's throw away from that village of Nain. So people who saw what Jesus did there in Nain for the widow's son would have immediately connected it with the Elisha story. And they declare what the people in the Elijah and Elisha stories declared. This is a great prophet from God. It's unique, too, in the stories that with both Elijah and Elisha, they perform something. There's a physical act. Elijah lays on top of the boy 3 times. Elisha lays on top of the boy he raises from the dead twice, and he breathes into his mouth. He puts his eyeballs next to the kid's eyeballs. He puts his hands on the kid's hands. So for the people who know those stories and are now seeing what Jesus did with the widow's son, know that for Jesus, it took mere words to do those things. So in their mind, it means this is a prophet even greater than Elijah and Elisha. Now, in Jewish tradition, the young boy in the stories of Elisha had a name. And in Jewish tradition, that boy's name is Jonah. If you think about the story of Jonah, just as a backstory, Jonah was a prophet. There's a book named after him in the Old Testament. And if you look at that story, at the beginning of that story, God calls Jonah to go to a Gentile city called Nineveh. He doesn't want to go there. So what does he do? He goes and he gets on a boat goes out into the sea. There's a great storm that happens as a result. He's asleep. They wake him up, and immediately he knows it's his fault that this has happened. And so he tells them, what you need to do is throw me overboard, throw me into the sea, and the storm will stop. And so sure enough, they do, and it does. So we pick up with this in the story of Jonah. Now the Lord provided a huge fish, sometimes we call it a whale, to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Already, some of you are probably making a connection. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress, I called, and he answered me. From in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. To the roots of the mountain, I sank down. The earth barred me in forever. You, Lord my God, brought my life from the pit, up from the grave. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord. I remember you, Lord, and my praise to you. I with shoutful praise, with sacrifice, what I have vowed to make good, I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. And then the Lord commanded the fish and vomited Jonah by ground. So what strikes you right away in the story is Jonah's thanking. He calls out to God, thankful that God has even heard him. In that last little cartoon, it makes the joke about Jonah trying to call 911 from this fish, but he doesn't get cell service. But essentially, he did call 911. He called God, and God did answer him. There was a woman who got on a plane. She sat down, she opened her Bible, she starts reading it, and this guy sits down next to her, and he's a very intellectual, college professor guy, and he looks at it and he kind of scoffs at her reading the Bible, and he says, you really believe that? And she says, yeah. He said, what about the Jonah and the whale story? And she says, yeah, I believe that. And he says, how could that happen? How could that even happen? And she says, I don't know. I guess when I get to heaven, I'll ask him. And he says, well, what if Jonah isn't there? And she said, well, I guess you'll have to ask him then. In my distress, from the depths of the grave, from the pit. What's intriguing about Jonah's prayer here, about thanking God for salvation, is that he prayed the prayer from inside the fish. We would expect him to pray the prayer of thanksgiving and salvation after he's out of the fish and onto dry ground. But no, he thanks God for hearing him. He thanks God for sending salvation while he's inside of the fish. He wasn't thanking God for delivering him from the fish, but for delivering him into the fish. The fish wasn't the source of Jonah's distress, it was the source of his salvation. He's in the depths of the grave and in distress. But what Jonah knew was that he was rescued from the darkness of the ocean, from that uncertainty, from what he called the grave, the pit. He was rescued from that. So we have, throughout Jonah's prayer there that we read through, all those things that he prays correspond to a psalm, which always strikes me as really cool, that in his time of discomfort, in his time of distress, in his time of feeling like he's in the pit, he's in the grave, and being rescued, he uses the words of God to talk to God. And so I always, for those of you who are part of the Psalms class, for the first session this summer, you know that the Psalms, there's no better book in the Bible for, true, I think, human emotions. Joy, sadness, anger, frustration, thanksgiving, hope. All kinds of human emotions are found in the Psalms. And I encourage you, to find Psalms that express human emotions that you often feel, and just keep them on hand. Put them up on your mirror at home. Keep it in your, wallet or purse or something to go to that, to be able to use the words of God to be your words to God. So then we get to Luke chapter 8. And it says that it's going to tell us that, Jesus and the disciples go to the other side of the lake. So at the video at the beginning, he was talking about how they would go to the other side of the lake. Here's kind of what that would look like. I put the little green arrow kind of moving from the Jewish side to essentially the Gentile side, going to the other side of the lake as they're traveling here. One day, Jesus was, let's go over to the other lake. So they got into a boat, set out. As they sailed, a squall on the lake so that the boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. The disciples went and saying, Master, Master, we're drowned. He got up the wind and the ragers. The storm subsided calm. Where is your, he asked his disciples. Fear and amazement, they asked her, who is this? He commands even the wind and water, and they obey. So clearly, the picture here that Luke is giving us is Jesus as master of this was probably, sometimes we see like paintings and other stuff of Jesus calming a storm, and there's rain and like thunderstorms and stuff. This probably wasn't that. This is probably a windstorm that the guy in the video was talking about happening at certain times of year in this region. We also get it from the stories because he says he rebukes the wind and the raging waters that are coming up, from the result of the wind. And then they even ask, he even commands the wind and the water. So this is a major windstorm that they're looking at him and saying, I can't believe that he can even do this. So when we look at this story in light of the Jonah story that is so similar, we see that like Jonah emerges from essentially the tomb in his mind of the great fish after 3 days. So too, Jesus emerges from the tomb on the third day. And just as the darkness of the fish was the source of salvation for Jonah, so too for us, the darkness of the tomb of Christ is the source of our salvation. So, but again, just like the stories of Elijah and Elisha raising the only sons of those women, and then Jesus doing the same thing, where he only has to speak words to do that, whereas they perform some kind of physical act to bring that about. When you look at these stories side by side, they're both asleep. But when Jonah wakes up, he knows it's his fault, and he has to be thrown overboard, and then God calms the storm. In the story with Jesus, Jesus himself wakes up and calms the storm. So this is, again, just showing that Jesus is even a greater prophet than Jonah, is what they would have been sensing and having in their minds as they are seeing this and experiencing this, living with Jesus. Are there any questions or comments on that? So we'll continue that Luke's going to continue this comparison and contrast between Jesus and Jonah. So again, here's our little map of all these significant places around where Jesus grew up. We'll go just to the one with Nazareth. So just a little bit away from Nazareth, this would be maybe a couple-hour walk at the most, is that town. That is the hometown of Jonah. So when the people, again, seeing Jesus do these things, that they're immediately connected with Jonah, they're even thinking about their hometowns and how close they were. Like, Jesus grew up right over there. Jonah grew up right over there. Look at what Jesus is doing compared to what Jonah did. Yeah. Oh, the question is there any significance to him being thrown overboard instead of just jumping in? In all likelihood, it was so that they were experiencing, that they were doing something to bring that about, that they were making some sort of amends to God, and that because they do the act of throwing him overboard, then and God then calms the storm. So it's probably just really about their involvement in the act of what's going on. Okay, so they get to the other side. They sail to the region of the you can see it says Gerasenes, Gergesenes, or Gadarenes. Depending on what translation of the Bible you're looking at and which gospel, you probably got one of those three. The different gospels and different translations say different versions of where they actually are. But the point is, it's across the lake from the Jewish region, the Galilee region. When Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a demon-possessed man from town. For a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but had lived in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had commanded the impure spirit to come out of the man. Many times it had seized him, and though he was chained hand and foot and kept under guard, he had broken his chains and had been driven by the demon into solitary places. So again, here's a map. It's kind of pinpointing those three different cities that you might see in the Bible there. Probably in all it might be where the top one. If you go today, that's the site visit is Kursi, Gergesa. But the point is, look at all are over on the eastern, they're to the river Jordan, the east of Galilee, which means they're in territory. So that's all you really need to know specifically about that. So this man, he's demon possessed. He goes over. Jesus encounters him, and he asks him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had gone into him. And they begged Jesus repeatedly, that's the demons begging, not to order them to go into the abyss. That same word is what Jonah was talking about. The abyss, the pit, the grave, Sheol. A large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. The demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs, and he gave them permission. When the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. When those tending the pigs saw what had happened, they ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. So again, here's the town as where it is today. You can kind of see it's directly across from Magdala and across the lake, as they would call it, from Jesus' adopted hometown of Capernaum. Today, you would see ruins of like a monastery. That's kind of what you're seeing down there. In the very top right corner of the picture, you can see the Sea of Galilee there. There's kind of a monastery, ruins down in the middle. In the upper, you see a red square. In that square is a chapel that up on the hill. I go to the next slide. So in that time, the Sea of Galilee probably came to see the road farther. So it would have been closer to where the hillside is today. But if you look at this slide, this is kind of down beneath. That red arrow, again, is pointing to what was in the red box before. It's a little chapel that's built up on the hill. Because in the yellow square you can see there's tombs in the hillside. So this became a spot where people pinpointed that this would have been a likely spot for this to happen, because the pigs could run down that hill straight into the sea. Funny enough, if you think about pig farming, there's pigs over there, which automatically would tell you that this is a Gentile area, because Jews don't eat pigs. They're considered very, very unclean. In the 60s, the modern country of Israel decided to ban all pigs in the country and pig farming. And oddly enough, one of the ways they got rid of all the pigs that were in the country is they drowned them in the sea. So it's kind of a funny little twist there that's how they got rid of them. Then a bunch of Christians complained that they wanted pork in the country, and so now in this day, there's a couple farms in Israel where you can raise pigs and stuff, so the Christians can still have their like pepperoni and sausage pizzas. Which is true. You have to go to certain pizza places in like Jerusalem to get that. So this whole thing, a legion at the time was thousands of troops. So if you think about that, a comparison, this man is possessed seemingly by thousands of demons. Here's a very realistic portrayal of the pigs going into the sea. But why pigs? Why pigs? Why this demons being cast into pigs? I don't know, maybe certainly out of convenience. They're in a Gentile area. There's pigs nearby. Maybe it's just out of convenience. But in Isaiah chapter 65, if you look there, Isaiah in that section is talking to a Gentile audience. the setting of where Isaiah is talking to that Gentile audience is in mountains or hills next to tombs. What he's talking to that Gentile audience about in Isaiah is the sin of sacrifice, because they were consuming pork. They were eating pigs. And then, of course, Isaiah casts judgment upon the wicked people, just like Jesus cast judgment upon the demons. And then in the story in Isaiah, just like in this story in Luke, there's salvation for the Gentiles. So I think for Jesus, for the listener and the reader of Luke's gospel, would be making those connections about where Jesus is, what he's doing. Why pigs? Oh, think of the story in Isaiah when, Isaiah encountered pigs in a Gentile area. This is also, Luke is going to constantly, like I said, compare and contrast Jesus and Jonah throughout these stories. And just as Jonah's salvation is from the sea, the destruction was in the sea and his salvation was from it. In this story, it's kind of the opposite. The destruction goes into the sea. So moving on with our story, when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone out sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured. Then all the people of the region of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them because they were overcome with fear. So he got into the boat and left. The man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with them, but Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return home and tell how much God has done for you." So the man went away and told all over town how much Jesus had done for him. So this certainly casting into this large herd of swine, of pigs, would have been a major financial, economic loss for whoever owned those pigs. So certainly the people in this area, this surrounding countryside, are not going to be very happy with what Jesus did here, because it represents a major loss of money. But again, I put this painting in because it tells us that this man is sitting at Jesus' feet. We're going to see this more tonight, but we've already seen it in Luke's gospel that for Luke, being at the feet of Jesus is where disciples are. That's where you find disciples, is at the feet of Jesus. So it's not just a flippant remark for Luke to say that this man, a demon-possessed man who's now been healed, is at the feet of Jesus. And again, this would have been unique too, because the demon-possessed man obeys Jesus' call to go and tell the Gentile, the people in the region of the Decapolis, those Gentile cities. This man immediately obeys Jesus and goes to those Gentiles to spread the word, whereas Jonah was disobedient in God's call to him to go to the Gentile area. So in this, for Luke, the demon-possessed man is a Jonah-like prophet. Like he answers the call that Jonah didn't. And of course, Jesus is the greater prophet than that. Any questions or comments on that?
But he would have been a Gentile, right? The demon-possessed man?
Yeah, it's a good question. Would the demon-possessed man have been a Gentile? In all likelihood, some people speculate that he was a Jewish person who had been sent away to this area because he was demon-possessed. Tombs, of course, would have been considered unclean. So some people think that he was forced to go live there, but he was a Jew. But in all likelihood, he's a Gentile, because we see Jesus, Luke doesn't do this as much as Mark. In Mark, there's something called the Messianic secret. That's what Bible nerds call it, where Jesus is constantly telling people, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone what I did for you. Don't tell anyone who I am. Luke keeps some of that in his gospel, even though he doesn't really add to Luke's value, like what Luke is trying to show, his themes in his gospel. Some of it's still there. But for Luke, it's also where it's the Jewish people who are told to keep quiet, but the Gentiles are told to go spread the news. So him telling this man to go spread the news to the Gentile regions probably means he's a Gentile. Good question, though. Any other question or comment? Yeah, that's a great point. He's the first Christian missionary, is what Pam said. Now, technically, the early church declared that the Samaritan woman at the well that Jesus encounters in the Gospel of John, she has traditionally in church history been called the first missionary. Now, we don't know necessarily when the chronology lined up, but the point is well taken. He is certainly, been given a call kind of as a missionary to go out to the Gentile areas. And again, for Luke, what he cares about is this demon-possessed man obeyed the call, and Jonah didn't obey the call to go to the Gentile area. So they cross back across the lake, and when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. We get a man's name in this story. It's not unique. We often get the men's names and often don't get women's names from this time period. But Jairus especially, he's a prominent member of society. He's a synagogue leader. So he's somebody that everybody respected. He's somebody that had some sort of, power in some way or another. And this man, look again where Luke says he is. A man named Jairus, the synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet. So already we kind of know that what to expect out of this man. But just by where Luke is telling us this man is, at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter. Now, Luke's the only one that tells us she's his only daughter. Mark and Matthew have the same story, but don't say that she's his only daughter. Why would Luke tell us that? Because the widow in Nain. That was her only son. Now, Luke, who loves to pair stories of men with stories of women, not always back to back. These are in consecutive chapters, but not always back to back. This is Luke pairing this story of the Jairus' daughter, this girl, with the story of the widow of Nain. It was her only son. This is his only daughter. A girl of about 12 was dying. As Jesus was on his way, he seems to leave immediately. Jairus, for whatever it is, it says she's dying. We don't know. It says she's about 12. So we don't know. Some people have speculated that part of what he's distressed about is when you're a girl and you're 12, you're about to be given away in marriage. And that usually came with a bride price. Sometimes you have a dowry, something like that. And so people said, well, that's what the father's upset about. Like, he's upset that his daughter's about to die and he's about to lose out on this money. But that doesn't seem to be a good fit for this story. We find him in Luke's words at Jesus' feet. And Jesus seems to leave immediately. It doesn't seem very likely Jesus would leave immediately to go help if this is a man just concerned about wealth and that alone. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal. I said this in week 1, but when we talked about who wrote this gospel, and according to Paul, Luke seems to be a physician. He's a doctor. And so we get some clues from him sometimes in that. Whereas Mark and Matthew in this same story tell us that she went to all kinds of doctors and nobody could help her. And in the English, that comes across sometimes as just, they're like, I don't know what else to try. Like, I don't know what to do. But in the Greek, the impression is they were ripping her off. They were taking her money knowing they couldn't help her. So it would have been put doctors in a very bad light. So Luke conveniently leaves that out of his gospel. He just says, hey, no one could help her. No one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. So sometimes this is called with a hemorrhage. The bleeding issue is essentially just a constant state of menstruation. So instead of once a month, it's constant for 12 years. Now notice again the language Luke the clues that he's giving us in this. How old is Jairus' daughter? She's 12. How old is this woman? How long has this woman been ill? 12 years. For Luke, that's significant because what it's telling us is these two women, one an adult and one a young woman, one a girl, about to be considered an adult, they're both useless to society. The girl, a 12-year-old girl, was worthless in that society, essentially. There was no social standing, nothing. There wasn't anything about a 12-year-old girl that would be particularly valuable. And so for this woman, just like the 12-year-old girl, she's been bleeding for 12 years. She equally is of no worth to society. In fact, she's a detriment to society around her. And so Luke is partnering these stories of these two women. And again, look at where Jairus approaches Jesus. He's a prominent member of society. Everybody respects him. He comes straight at Jesus, comes straight face to face, goes to Jesus' feet to ask for help. Where does it say this woman was? Behind him. She has to come behind Jesus, touches the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. So for this woman, who, again, it tells us, no one could help her. She seems to have spent all her money trying to get help. This woman is financially bankrupt. She's socially bankrupt. She's physically bankrupt. This is a woman who's desperate. And notice that Jairus comes and intercedes on behalf of his daughter. But the woman has to intercede on behalf of herself, that she's all she's got. Nobody else would help her because nobody else would want to come near her because she would be considered constantly unclean. Who touched me? Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. But Jesus said, someone me. I know the power out from me. Then the woman that she could not unnoticed. I love that little bit by Luke. It recalls the story we last week of the woman anointing at his feet. And Jesus looks at the woman, but says to Simon, do you this woman? And so here Luke includes this language. Then the woman, seeing could not go unnoticed. This is a woman that would have, society wanted her to be invisible. And now, and she probably, she's probably constantly trying to fly under the radar. But now she can't go unnoticed. She came trembling and fell at his feet. So again, the at his feet. We expect then from Luke that Jairus is doing what a disciple does, being at Jesus' feet. So too, this woman at Jesus' feet is doing what a disciple is supposed to do in Luke's gospel. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Now, in the Greek, in our English here, it says she told why she had touched him. In the Greek, it says she told the whole truth. She told the whole truth about why she had touched him. Now, notice where she is and who she's telling in Luke's gospel here. It says something. I lost it. Did I scroll too far? Oh, so she told the whole truth in the presence of all the people. So for Luke, she is making a public declaration. In Luke's mind, who is that like? Anna, from the beginning of his gospel, who is the one Simeon comes and has a private conversation with Mary and Joseph. But Anna makes the public declaration about who Jesus is. And so this woman is making a public declaration just like Anna did. Anna, of course, was considered what a disciple was supposed to be. And so was Simeon. But Anna's the one that makes the public declaration. So this woman at the feet of Jesus, speaking the whole truth in a public setting, is doing what a disciple is supposed to do. And then he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Now that, again, Luke cares about the details. So he cares about the words that he uses. He tells us, he uses the word Jairus' daughter. Now, when he goes and speaks to this woman who has been healed, he says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. So again, he is linking these stories together. Last week, I showed you pictures from the church in Magdala called Duc in Ultum, which means go into the deep, after Jesus commands the disciples to push their boats out into the deep and fish again. And this painting is from that church. That's the whole painting. It's not cut off, but that's partly why I like it. You probably can't I don't know if you can make it out in that, but where it shows her finger touching the cloak of Jesus, it's kind of like glowing, almost like, power, like a little spark or something. But I just always liked that painting there at church of this story, because all you're seeing is the crowd with all they're found. You're at the bottom of Jesus' cloak, and you're seeing that woman. You don't see face, not just her reaching out just to get that of Jesus' cloak, because she believes that she can be healed, which is a significant thing. Think of how many people she's trusted that let her down. All those doctors, all these people she trusted to help her that let her down. And not just let her down, but probably ripped her off. So for her to trust Jesus in this sense that she would risk going into the crowd, which is an absolute no-no for her as an unclean woman. She would not have been allowed to do that. But she risks it because she trusts what will happen when she reaches out to Jesus. So while Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, he said. Don't bother the teacher anymore. This has got to be, man, when I read this, I wonder what just sitting there thinking, this interaction is happening with Jesus and this woman. He's got to be thinking like, hey, this is nice and all, but my daughter is dying. Like, can we speed this along? Like, can we get going? But it was too late. Somebody comes along and says, your daughter's dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, don't be afraid. Just believe and she will be healed. When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. Stop wailing, Jesus said. She is not dead, but asleep. They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, my child, get up. Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. So again, at this point, once the rabbis at the time would say, if you see a funeral procession, don't bother praying that it's not one of your family members, because it's already too late. This is kind of what's happening in this instance. It's too late already. And there's somebody comes to tell Jairus, it's too late. Nothing can be done. And Jesus says, something can be done. And I like this picture of him. It's like she's kind of got one leg off the bed and about to stand up, and he's got her hand about to pull her up. But again, this moment of it's his only daughter. For Luke, telling us it's only daughter, just like the widow's son was her only son. So we have those two stories, a man and a woman's stories connected. But we also have, this story is immediately following the healing of the demon-possessed man. So the healing of this woman is Luke once again pairing stories of men and women in his gospel. Any questions or comments? So at the beginning of chapter 9, when Jesus had called the 12 apostles together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons, to cure diseases, and he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. He told them, take nothing for the journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. So they set out and went from village to village, proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere. So Luke is building here. His language he's using. He sent them out. Take nothing for the journey. They set out. Remember that Luke is building to this moment that's happening in a few verses here of the turning of Jesus towards Jerusalem. The journey narrative that Luke is going to tell us throughout his gospel. This is going to be the focus, the heart of his gospel, this journey narrative. So he's using language already when Jesus sends out the 12. He sends them out, go on a journey. They set out. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. But the crowds learned about it and followed him. He welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing. Late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away so they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place here." He replied, "You give them something to eat." They answered, "We only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Unless we go and buy food for all this crowd," and Luke tells us about 5,000 men were there. So we often assume, that means not counting women and children. So who knows how large the crowd is. But he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." The disciples did so, and everyone sat down. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up at heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. So it's funny, when Jesus says, "You give them something to eat," to feed that many people would probably take the average person's 7-8 month salary. So, Jesus, and remember, that's if they had a salary. Most of the apostles had left their salaries, had left their jobs to follow him. So it seems weird that he says, "Well, you give them something to eat." And they got to be like, "Well, how are we supposed to do that? We got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and that's it." For Luke, part of the reason he's telling the story, this is the only story that appears in all 4 Gospels, actually, besides like the Passion narrative, the crucifixion, death and resurrection. But even they tell those differently, which we'll get to next week. But they all tell this story. For Luke, this is about a couple different things. It's about the miracle of the manna from heaven in the story of Moses, leading the people in the wilderness. But guess who else it's like? The prophet Elisha, the same prophet that lived nearby, that kept doing these things that Jesus is constantly being compared to. The prophet Elisha had a miracle of multiplying food and having leftovers. So for the people seeing this, they are recognizing, again, just what they are seeing in Jesus. Luke tells us this happens right after the apostles back from being sent out by Jesus. He sends them into the surrounding town to heal people, to preach people. Now he gets them back. It's almost like he's doing a debrief session with them. Like, tell me what you learned. Tell me how it went when you went out there. So this is probably a lesson in faith, certainly from Jesus to the apostles, that here's all these people that need food. He says, you feed them, and then this miracle is performed. So it certainly must be some sort of lesson in faith. There's a church father, Origen, that first talked about, we have the feeding of the 5,000 and we have the feeding of the 4,000, and different gospel writers tell us those happen in different places. But what's important is, in this story, they pick up 12 basketfuls of leftovers. So that's essentially 1 basket per disciple. You got to imagine that for Jesus trying to teach a lesson in faith, how convicting it would be for each disciple to have to go pick up the basket of leftovers. Like, I didn't believe this could happen, and now I got to go pick up one of these baskets and take it back with me. Certainly, it also represents the 12 tribes of Israel as well. Now, in the other feeding of the multitude story, they pick up 7 basketfuls of leftovers. Why that's significant is when Joshua led the people into the promised land, there were 7 Gentile nations living in the promised land at the time. So the bottom line for Luke is, Jesus has come for the Gentiles and the Jewish people alike. Once when Jesus was praying in private, we've seen this, remember, over and over again, this retreat in advance, that he prays in private, goes and talks to God in private, and then makes some sort of advancement in his life and in his ministry. Once when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, "Who do the crowd say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets long ago has come back to life. Maybe Elisha, maybe Jonah. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" And Peter answered, God's Messiah. And he said, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the teachers of the law. He must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. And he said to them all, whoever wants to be a disciple must deny himself and take up their cross and follow me. So it says the advancement against his ministry and his life. Building up to this moment, he's going to turn towards Jerusalem. And so when he gets praised privately, then has a station with his apostles, begins to tell them finally he needs to go to Jerusalem, why he's going to travel on this journey towards Jerusalem. And that this language he uses, though, I don't think it never strikes us, I think, as Christians. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. Because we think of it in terms of Jesus. Jesus took up a cross. If I'm going to be a disciple of Jesus, I follow Jesus. I take up a cross. But this wouldn't have made any sense to them at this time. Because all they knew about taking up a cross was somebody who was going to be crucified. You took up the beam that went across and you carried it to your crucifixion site, and then they hoisted you up and nailed you to it and it to the vertical piece of wood. And so that's all they knew. The language to the apostles would have been very confusing about why would I do this? Nobody would rightly choose to take up a cross. And that's exactly Jesus' point. If you're going to follow me, you got to do the unthinkable. You got to do what doesn't come natural. You got to take up your cross. Then we have this very weird story. I think it's always can be a little confusing, the transfiguration. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him, and he went up on a mountain to pray. So again, going off to pray privately. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as the flash of lightning. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. So when it says they spoke about his departure, the word there is Exodus. They're talking about that's Jesus' Exodus. So that certainly would carry a lot of meaning for Luke here if Jesus is talking to Moses, who led the Exodus out of Egypt, led the people of God to salvation. And so this idea that he's about to go on his departure, his Exodus, is talking about Jesus leading the people of Israel and the Gentiles to salvation. This is the only time in the Bible we get an explicit time that both Moses and Elijah are together, or it tells us they're together. Now, the way that they are connected other than that is they are the only two people to go up Mount Sinai. I mean, Joshua, as Moses' helper, seems to have gone with them at least once or something, but it was Moses and Elijah at separate times that went up Mount Sinai and talked with God and saw God. So so for Luke, it's significant in this instance for his readers and listeners to understand that Jesus now, preparing for the Exodus, is going up on a mountain and meeting with Moses and Elijah, the only other people to go up on a mountain and talk with and see God. We don't know where this happens. It just says that they go up on a high mountain. In the purple circle there is Mount Tabor, and then the picture on the right is Mount Tabor. It stands out very obviously in the Jezreel Valley. Up on top, the pictures on the left are two churches up there to the Transfiguration, a Greek Orthodox and a Catholic church. But no buses can get up. Not a lot of people go there, but this is a site of the duration, but we don't actually know where it took place. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," since he did not know what he was saying. I mean, for Luke, this is probably some kind of alien. Peter's putting up shelters is essentially tabernacles. So in Jewish faith, they have a feast tents, a festival of tabernacles that remembers the time that they lived under Moses' hip. So for Peter, this makes, let's put up some tabernacles. Let's put up some tents, some shelters for all of you. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at the time what they had seen. So just like the baptism at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, where God declares, "This is my son," now we have this moment of the transfiguration where Jesus' ministry is about to completely change as he sets his face to Jerusalem for the crucifixion, that we have this affirmation again from God that this is his son. Any questions or comments on that? So finally we get to the moment, Luke 9:51. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village. So again, this idea, it says Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. In different English translations, it says Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem, which is kind of more of a literal translation of the Greek language. He set his face to go to Jerusalem. So again, this is the turning point of Luke's gospel, everything heading towards Jerusalem here in this travel narrative, this journey narrative that Jesus is taking. And again, as a reminder, what Luke has Jesus doing in about a half a chapter, Luke is going to show in 10 chapters. So it's important for Luke to show this journey of Jesus going to Jerusalem as a turning point here in his gospel. So they're leaving from up north. I had this map up when we looked at the path for Mary and Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Because from up north, you would take one of two ways. Either go down Jordan River Valley, which is the yellow line on the right. You go down on the Jordan River Valley, have water the whole time, follow that along, get to up from Jericho, up the hills where Jerusalem is there. Or you could be straight down the middle of the country, but that's where you Samaritan story. And so again, for Samaritan Jews did not get along at all. Just the backstory of Samaritans. When the Assyrian Empire came in and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, they intermarried with them and basically then had children that were half Assyrian, half Jewish. So for Jewish people, they considered Samaritans half-breeds and not real Jews. Now, Samaritans continued to practice the same religion, but in a different place. Like the Jews had the temple in Jerusalem. The Samaritans built a temple on Mount Gerizim near a city called Shechem that we see throughout the Bible. So they built a temple there. So when they passed through, Jews passed through the Samaritan area, there could be major problems between them. In fact, this idea about calling down fire is really reminiscent of the prophet Elijah calling fire down on the prophets of Baal. And it also probably has something to do with for a Samaritan, if a Jewish person was walking by your property and they stepped on the very corner of your field of crops, they'd burn the whole field because a Jewish person stepped on the corner there. And so there's probably some kind of reciprocation there by the disciples saying, "Hey, should we call fire down on these people too?" And Jesus, of course, tells them not to do that. As they were walking along, a man said, "I will follow you wherever you go." This is, again, Luke showing us now, right after Jesus has set his face to Jerusalem, begins to ask the question and answer it, what is it to be a disciple? Jesus replied, "Den and birds have nests, Son of Man has no place to lay his head." He said to another man, "Follow me." But he replied, "Lord, first let me bury my father." Jesus said to him, "Let them bury their own dead, but go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Still another said, "I will, Lord, but first let me go back and say to my family." Jesus replied, "No, it's a hand to the plow, back, and is fit for the service of the kingdom of God." So things to note there. Jesus isn't being overly insensitive when the man says, "Let me go bury my father," and Jesus says, "No." It's not like the funeral's about to happen. He says, "Let me go attend the funeral, and then I'll be right with you. Give me half an hour or something." And Jesus says, "No." What happened then is somebody was buried. Then a year later, once their body had decomposed and the only thing left was bones. You went back in, collected the bones, put them in an ossuary, a bone box, and then put it in like a family tomb. And so essentially this man could be asking for up to a year to be able to do that. This idea about putting a hand on the plow and looking back, if you were using a plow, you had to keep facing straight ahead so that you made a straight line. If you look to the side or look back, you start to, skew off to one side or the other. So it's essentially the picture Jesus is giving. You got to keep focused. You can't be looking at all these other things and be distracted, or you won't be able to follow me. One thing significant about that is there's a story of the prophet Elijah who found the prophet Elisha plowing in the field one day, and Elisha and he asked him to come with him. And Elisha said, let me go say goodbye to my family first. And Elijah says yes. He lets him do that. So the picture Luke gives is the call that Jesus gives to disciples, to us, is a more radical call than what Elijah had given to Elisha. Any questions or comments on that? Because we're going to focus really here on chapter 10. And what Luke is doing here in his stories, and what he's going to tell us about what it means to be a disciple. So Luke chapter 10, verse 38 says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. Martha was distracted by all the preparation that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you that my sister has to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried about many things, but things are needed. Need only one. Mary had what is better and not be taken away from her. I remember that show, Last Man Standing, with Tim Allen. If you've seen that, there was this where all of a sudden Tim Allen, the husband, gets home, and he's got his dad and brother with him. And he didn't tell his wife that he was bringing them home. So, of course, she's happy to see them, goes and gives them hugs and kisses and says, why didn't you tell me that you were coming? And they said, well, if we told you, you would have just been out buying food, getting the guest beds made up, blah, blah, blah. And she says, okay. And then she turns and starts to walk out of the room. And they said, where are you going? She said, I'm going to buy food and get the guest beds made up. and I always think of that clip when I think of this story. What's interesting is right away, a couple of the things that Luke tells us. It tells us Martha opened her home to him. So automatically we know that what Martha is doing from the start, opening her home to him, is exactly what Jesus told the 12 apostles when he sent them out what to expect. He said, some people will open their home to you. Go in and depend on what they're offering you. Go in and depend on their service as you go out and perform your ministry. So right away we see that Martha has opened her home to him. And where do we find Mary sitting? At the feet of Jesus. And Luke, of course, has shown us throughout his gospel how significant that is. Because that's where you find a disciple, is sitting at the feet of Jesus. She's sitting in a place that's normally reserved for learners from a teacher. In other words, sitting in a spot that's normally reserved for men. But as Luke has already shown us throughout his gospel, that's where we also find women who are disciples of Jesus. And it's interesting that for Mary, there's nothing in Luke's text that makes it sound like Mary feels strange or uncomfortable being in that place. She doesn't feel strange being one of Jesus' disciples. And likewise, there's nothing in Luke's text that tells us that Jesus is surprised to see her there. That this is something that Jesus would have and could have expected. We also just saw this in the story of the demon-possessed man. Once he was healed and cleared of the demons, where was he found? At the feet of Jesus. Then he was sent out as a missionary. Paul himself says, I studied at the feet of Gamaliel, his teacher. Paul tells us that. So this idea of being at the feet of a teacher is significant because that's where you find one of their disciples. And that's where we find Mary. But inevitably, when we look at this story, there's always people that hear or know this story and they say, I hate this story. There's lots of people that hate this story, usually because of the way that we've translated. I mean, and the reason they hate it is not because they love tedious housework. It's not like they're like, I love that. I want to keep doing that. I want to do what Martha's doing, and so I hate this story. But they hate it because it hits close to home. You know, we can identify with Martha, both men and women. Because we you know, there's stories in the Bible that I don't think we can always grasp and identify with. There's an old joke of a farmer who's, you know, he's swerving his car, and of course the county sheriff pulls up behind him and pulls him over and goes up and says, what's going on? Like, he says, I see a open bottle next to you. What's in that? And the farmer says, oh, that's just water. And the sheriff grabs it and smells it. He says, it smells like wine. And the farmer says, praise the Lord, he did it again. But those stories of water to wine and the feeding of the 5,000, you know, imagine tonight if we showed up in the team out there, just for all of us, had one plate of pasta salad and like half a bag of chips or something. Like the story of the feeding of the 5,000. We'd think they're nuts. Like, what are you doing? I mean, if they can turn that into enough food for all of us, somebody give them a bottle of water and see if they can turn that to wine too for all. But, you know, we don't always identify with these miraculous stories. But we see a woman like Martha and what she's doing, and I think a lot of us, you know, identify with her. Here's an example of a painting of this story. Some of these paintings throughout history, I kind of like because the focus is still on Martha. Look in the background there's Mary sitting at Jesus' feet. But the focus, the artwork here, is on Martha and she looks a little sad, bummed out, but so who knows if the kind of rebuke or correction by Jesus has already happened here. But I think a lot of people identify with her. Here's another one. I put this in a red box because then otherwise it's almost impossible to make out that very far background is Martha at the feet of Jesus. There's this elaborate scene. Of course, this is, you know, medieval artwork. It's, the way they portray it is likewise. Again, I think a lot of us identify with what Martha is doing. That a lot of us are doers and servers. And when we hear this story, that's why people are like, oh, I hate this story. Makes it seem like what I feel like I contribute to ministry is not valuable. I think we've all shown up at Thanksgiving, and, you know, there's people that are hard at work in the kitchen, you know, in the dining room, elsewhere, and then there's always some people on the couch. I'm not gonna say which gender is normally which in this, especially because sometimes men are the ones cooking, but we'll just leave it at that. But I think most of us can identify with this, you know, this scene, this aspect of what's happening here, and so we get angry at this story. But that's kind of because we've treated it like a cartoon in a lot of ways. It seems like it's black and white, that what Martha is wrong and Mary is right. But it can't be that simple, because we've already seen it's Martha who welcomes Jesus into her home. And what she's doing is diakone, that word we've seen before in Luke's gospel, serving. She is serving. And what do we see? Who do we see serving? Disciples. So it can't just be that Martha is wrong and Mary is right. To help us understand, we look at what happens before this. At the beginning of this chapter is this. Now, Jesus had sent out the 12. Now he's sending out 72 of his disciples. And again, similarly, he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers to his harvest field. Go! I am sending you out like among wolves. Do not take a bag or sandals, and do not greet anyone. When you enter a house, for peace to this house. Who promotes peace is there, peace will rest on them. But if turn to you, stay there eating whatever they give you, whatever they give you. For the deserves his wages, deserves their wages. So again, to start, Luke already telling us at the beginning of his chapter, because of people like that their entire will be possible. Their ministry is going to be able to flourish because of people like Martha. So the disciples have a responsibility in their ministry and their discipleship to ministering to the world. The only way they're going to be able to do that is because of people like Martha. That's what Luke is telling us. You know, later in Luke's gospel, he'll say, Jesus says, I am among you as one who serves. Mark is even more explicit. He says, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So the word that Luke uses there to describe what Martha is doing is the same word that's used to describe Jesus' whole purpose for being on earth. So again, we have to look at what Luke is telling us throughout this progression to this story of Martha and Mary. So before the story of Martha and Mary, we have the sending out of the 72. But we also have this story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, what is written in the law here? How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God, heart with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly. Jesus, do this and you'll live. So we kind of have to talk about what is a parable itself. It's a simile, a metaphor. It's something that compares something. I had been watching recently that if you've ever seen the show Parks and Rec, like they end up in Scotland, and the very famous Scottish poet Robert Burns has a little parable, has a little simile or metaphor that goes, oh, my love's like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. So that's it. That's the simple thing. Oh, my love's like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. So if you think about, well, what does that mean? If somebody hears, my love's like a red, red rose newly sprung in June, maybe it means that you have to keep love in water or it wilts. That doesn't really make any sense, but I guess you could draw that from his little parable there. Or maybe it means love is better by the dozen. That sounds dangerous. Maybe love's like a red, red rose newly sprung in June means I have to handle my love carefully because there's thorns, which I don't know. I guess that's a decent interpretation, but I wouldn't put that on a Hallmark card to your significant other at Valentine's Day. That's not something you want to say to them. Or maybe it means, well, by next month, love will fade and I'll just move on to the next one, So even in just a short little parable like that, there's different ways you can interpret it. Now, some of them make more sense than others, but when we look at parables that Jesus tells, the question is, how do we interpret it? How do we understand what Jesus is saying? I talked last week about how, just in our general societal parlance, we know that people know the term Good Samaritan. All over the world, all over this country, in Southern California, there are Good Samaritan hospitals. You've probably seen or heard of one, a Good Samaritan hospital. Franklin Graham started Samaritan's Purse. If you think about, if you've ever taken a CPR class, they tell you that there's a Good Samaritan law, which means if you're trying to help somebody and you're well-trained and something happens to them, you make a mistake, you're not going to be prosecuted because you're trying to be a Good Samaritan. The series finale of Seinfeld was premised on the idea that they see somebody being robbed and they don't help him, and the town, who has just passed a Good Samaritan law, prosecutes them for not helping the person that they should have. So even in our in just our general use, I think most of us are probably old enough to remember George W. Bush's presidency, but in his first inaugural address, if you remember, George W. Bush kind of had this push towards what he called compassionate conservatism. And this is what he said in his first inaugural address. I can pledge our nation to a goal. When we see that wounded traveler on the road to Jericho, we will not pass to the other side. So, of course, he's using it in the context that makes sense to him. And it's not a bad interpretation there. Now, probably some of you know who Margaret Thatcher is. She was the Prime Minister of England 40 years ago. She said this, no one would remember the Good Samaritan if he only had good intentions. He had money as well. Yikes. I don't know about that interpretation. That's more like she's using it in her context rather than the context that Jesus told it or that it was used in. So this man comes on one and asks, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Which is kind of a bad question. Because it makes it sound like you got to do one thing. It's like, Okay, I gotta give to this charity, or I gotta help this person, and it's just a single act. What must I do? What act must I do to get eternal life? And Jesus says, well, what's written in the law? How do you read it? And he gives this answer: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Essentially, he gives the answer, well, love God, love people. And Jesus says, you answered correctly. I mean, that's period, end of the conversation. Jesus says, you're right, do it and you'll live. Which is kind of a funny response from Jesus, because he doesn't really answer the man's question. The man asked about eternal life. But when the man says, love God, love people, and Jesus says, do that and you'll live, what he means is, you'll live now. That's how you should be living now, and that's how you live as a disciple now. Do that and you'll live. Go one slide, I'll just add the bottom, yeah. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Man, you know, I don't know if you think back in high school and college, if you ever assigned Shakespeare, and it's just you have no idea what that guy's talking about, and you go to ask your teacher, hey, what's this passage supposed to mean? And your teacher says, what do you think it means? Doesn't that drive you nuts? That drives me crazy. Well, what do you think it means? But that's a legitimate teaching method here for Jesus, and especially rabbis and teachers at this time, to ask questions back. What does the law say? How do you read it? And then this man wanting to justify himself, it says. So already Luke's giving us a clue that the man, the lawyer here, kind of has an ulterior motive. But his question, who is my neighbor, is a completely legitimate question. Because for anybody, any country, any nation, people, you got to know who your neighbors are and who the strangers are. And so this man, the question he's asking is a legitimate question, but we know that he's not asking it for a good reason, essentially, is what Luke is telling us. But the way he asks it, who is my neighbor? It's kind of like he's saying, hey, you tell me the rules of the game and I'll play it. You set the parameters and I'll follow the guidelines. Just tell me what rules I got to follow and I'll play the game however you want it. So who is my neighbor? Who is this person? Love God, love your neighbor. Who is my neighbor? So it's a legitimate question, and it really fits in. This was something you wanted to dig into at the time that made sense. There's a in Jewish tradition, there's a famous rabbi named Rabbi Eliezer, and one time people came to him and said, how far do we have to go to keep the commandment to honor your father and mother? How far do we have to go to in order to keep that commandment? And Rabbi Eliezer says, let me tell you a story. He said, there's a Gentile guy down in Ashkelon, down by the coast. And he has jewels. He sells jewels. And the priest came to him. Jewish priest came to this Gentile man and said, we need your jewels to decorate the high priest's, breastplate or whatever. We need those jewels. And they offered him what would be hundreds of thousands of dollars for these. And so he says, great. But then when he goes to get the jewels, he finds that the key to the safe that he keeps the jewels in is under the pillow where his dad is sleeping. He's taking a nap. So the man refuses to disturb his father to get the key to make the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he said, and then Rabbi Eliezer says, the very next year, the same Gentile man had a red heifer born in his herd. A red heifer is extremely rare to be born. And Jewish priests needed them because they had to offer them at certain times for certain sacrifices. So they come to this man and he says, I know that if I asked you for all the money in the world, you would give it to me because you need this red heifer that's in my herd. But he says, I'm only asking for the money I lost when I kept the commandment to honor my father. And so this is a natural thing to ask, how far do we have to go to keep that commandment? And who is my neighbor? What he's asking really is, which Jews do I have to love? That's in his mind, the lawyer's mind. He's only thinking in terms of the Jewish people. Okay, love my neighbor. Well, which Jews are my neighbor? That's what he wants to know. I mean, certainly not the tax collectors, certainly not the sinners, certainly not this unclean woman, But who are my neighbors? Tell me the rules and I'll play the game. Like, tell me who my neighbor is. In the Old Testament, there's 3 times that the command is given, and you shall love. We've already seen 2 of them, and you shall love the Lord your God, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then the third one is, and you shall love the foreigner, and you shall love the stranger. We only have a few minutes left, but let's go ahead and, actually, you know what? We'll start with that next week, the video. So hold off on that, Jer. I'll mention one last thing here to close us. Go to that next slide. Wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, let me tell you a story. So just like we saw Rabbi Eliezer. Now this is reminiscent of, in David's time, David sleeps with Bathsheba. Then he lies and cheats, and then he has Bathsheba's husband murdered. It's kind of impressive. He breaks about half the commandments in about 2 verses in the Old Testament. Kind of efficient, I guess, but not particularly righteous. But what happens right after that is the prophet Nathan comes in, this is in 2 Samuel, and says to David, I got a story to tell you. He says, there's a really rich man nearby. He's got flocks and flocks of sheep. And right next door is a man who has 1. And he says, the rich man had a party and invited a bunch of people over, and he, instead of killing a lamb from his herd, he went to Mary's little lamb next door and took that one from the only one that guy had and killed it and served it to his guests. And Nathan said to David, what should happen to that man? And David said, kill him. He's got to go. Like, he took what isn't his. And Nathan said, you're that man. He said, you took what didn't belong to you and you destroyed a family. How dare you? So right away with this teacher, this expert in the law, when he says, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus essentially says, I got a story to tell you. This expert in the law has got to be thinking, oh, man, this is not good for me. like, this is not going to go my way. Like, I know what happens when a teacher says, let me tell you a story. And that's what Jesus says. Let me tell you a story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Again, Luke's language here is important. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jericho is in the Jordan River Valley, which is part of the Great Rift Valley, which goes all the way down into Africa, and you can see from space. So Jericho's down low, like at or below sea level. Jerusalem's up in the mountains. So it's being very descriptive. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. You went down a highway called the Ascent of Adumim, because you ascended from Jericho to Jerusalem. For those of you who have been to Israel with me, you've been on the Ascent of Adumim. And that's the road that everybody knows Jesus is talking about. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and was attacked by robbers. We'll close just by looking at a couple pictures of what that looks like. You can see the very, if you're traveling down this like wadi, this valley here, how dangerous it could be if there's robbers nearby looking to do something, looking to attack you and rob. It had been a very dangerous place to be for this man traveling down. And when Jesus says a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, every listener and reader knew exactly what to picture. Oh, I know that road. I know exactly what he's talking about going down that road. So we'll pick up there next week and close out the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan and how it gets back to the story of Martha and Mary and why people hate that story and why it may not mean what we usually take it to mean. So again, next week will be our last week. We'll finish the parable of the Good Samaritan and Martha and Mary, talk about some of the other parables that Luke shares with the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son, the persistent widow, and then we'll close with talking about what makes Luke's story about the crucifixion and resurrection different from Mark and Matthew and John. So hope to see you next week.